to Episode 5 of Fixing America with J. Mill. In my introduction to this podcast, I stated that I agreed with one MAGA statement, that our government was and is broken and needs fixing. In this episode, we will begin to discuss what that means from several perspectives. What breaks about a government? If something breaks on your car, you take it to a mechanic and he takes it apart and comes out of his shop all greasy with a weird-looking part in his hand resting on a white paper towel and says, "Mr. J. Mill, see this here? This thingamabob is supposed to have a doohickey on this end. See this right here? Well, that broke right off, and I can't fix her. I got to order a new one, and that'll fix her up for about $836, plus a new gasket, keys, and about $1,235 labor, but she'll be good as new." In that case, you have a diagnosis, a plan, and a fix. My kids told me this example really dates me, but it's my example. I relate to it, and I'm sticking with it. But in any event, that is not how it works with a government. Maybe we need to back up and define what we mean by government. In its simplest terms, a government is how a society organizes itself to make rules, keep order, and provide services, like schools, roads, defense, and health care. That begs the question, what is a society? Again, in its simplest terms, because that's how I roll, a society is a group of people with common interests or goals. Geography is the starting point for how a society usually begins. Consider a wagon train of 20 families of settlers moving west who all decide to settle in a particular geographic area. Each family finds a piece of land and begins putting down roots by building a house. Some move to remote locations to cultivate crops or raise livestock. Others move to remote locations to live off the natural bounty of the land, and some stay near each other for added protection to provide services and manufacture products needed by their neighbors and other settlers passing through. Each family unit is a small society which creates its own form of government, but it has needs. Some family needs are unique to only them, but most families have needs common to others in their community, which can be supplied more readily and efficiently by cooperating with their neighbors. Some of the needs of society are solved without government. For example, suppose whiskey is a favorite beverage of 16 of the 20 families. One man in the community is skilled at distilling the beverage and can meet the inebriation demands of the whole community for a fair price. So everyone is happy. No government is needed. Suppose that after a short time, the community grows into a small town, surrounded by multiple gangs of outlaw hideouts nestled in the surrounding rocky outcroppings of the nearby mountains. The outlaws buy a large part of the whiskey maker's production, leaving the townspeople short of whiskey. More important, the outlaws frequently get tanked up, ransack the town, shoot up the buildings, molest the barmaids, and occasionally kill some unlucky citizens. That becomes a problem common to every citizen in the community, except the outlaws. The people of the community, that is, the society, get together and formulate a plan to deal with the problem. They agree that no person should be allowed to get tanked up, ransack the town, shoot up the buildings, molest the barmaids, and kill citizens in their community. They pass a law to that effect, which also authorizes the town to hire a sheriff to enforce the laws of their community. Then they promptly hire a sheriff, buy him a gun and a horse, authorize him to form a posse, and send him off to enforce their new law. The sheriff and the posse ride majestically out of town into the Badlands. They find some outlaws, shoot them, and return heroes. The whiskey flows, the piano roars, and the party draws the ire of the pious. That is government. Governments, like cars, are made up of parts. They may be tangible, that is physical, and intangible, non-physical. In the beginning, a government is totally intangible. It consists of the gathering of people who agree to create an organization for their mutual benefit. The authority they create, the rules they make, the boundaries they set, all start out as being intangible. As time passes, their government needs physical assets to serve its citizens, like a central meeting room for gatherings, leader meetings, and where government employees can work. Later, they may construct a courthouse, a jail, a water treatment facility, etc. But some of the most important parts of a government are the intangible parts. The ones that are not represented by a building are tied to something physical. Things like freedom of speech and press, due process, freedom of religion, right to privacy, separation of powers, checks and balances, majority rule and minority rights, and independent judiciary. Those are vital parts of a democracy. So, how do we determine when a democracy is broken? First, from a purely objective perspective, a democracy is considered to be broken when its institutions, processes, or norms no longer function in ways that uphold the core principles of democratic governance. The warning signs would include 1. The breakdown of free and fair elections. 2. The concentration of power in one branch of government, such as just the executive branch. 3. The erosion of the rule of law. 4. Suppression of freedom of speech and press. 5. Loss of democratic norms, such as the peaceful transfer of power, polarization, enemy list. And 6. The decline of citizen trust and participation, such as widespread apathy, extremism, anti-democratic, strongman alternatives. Our government started out broken to certain groups of Americans, even when viewed from a purely objective perspective. Black people, women, and immigrants were not afforded the same rights, privileges, and freedoms as white men. That is a fact. That was the stated intention of the drafters of our Constitution as originally written. And that is what the Constitution says that was signed and ratified on September the 17th, 1787. The Constitution upon which our democracy was officially created was based upon the premise, quote, that propertied white men are the only citizens fit for full participation in the civic arena. That breaks my heart. I lived most of my life believing that our Constitution was an almost sacred document written by brilliant, open-minded, future-oriented statesmen. That is what I was supposed to believe. That is what I was taught to believe. That our country was without fault. And one thing that seemed to support that image was the Declaration of Independence, which in 1776 declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." I was naive to assume that Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams intended the word men to be gender neutral and colorblind. American history, at least from my personal perspective, has been whitewashed in its depiction of the wholesomeness of our nation and its Constitution. Had it been pointed out to me in my youth that our Constitution, as written in 1776, excluded three broad classes of people, including my own mother and the braceros who came to work in our fields each summer, I would have had less respect for our Constitution and more respect for the amendments to it. I knew things were different, but I did not know that their rights were unconstitutionally different, except for the black people. The framers of our Constitution came from a culture that viewed propertied white men as the only citizens fit for full participation in the civic arena. Let that soak in. That bears repeating. The framers of our Constitution came from a culture that viewed propertied white men as the only citizens fit for full participation in the civic arena. Our Constitution expressly excluded black people, women, and immigrants from its protected status. They were, to use the Latin phrase, excluded ab initio, meaning from the beginning. Fortunately, the Constitution has evolved over the years with amendments. But even with amendments, it stayed that way for upwards of 180 years and has yet to reach the goal set by the language of the Declaration of Independence. And we're not talking about an insignificant minority group. The Constitution did not treat women much better than slaves. Well, that may be a bit exaggerated, but we are talking about, in 1776, a population of approximately 2.5 million people, with 52% male and 48% female. That is approximately 1.2 million females. At that time, and for the next 180 years, a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's, meaning that she could not own property, control her own possessions, or enter contracts independently. The Republic of Texas enacted the Married Women's Property Act, allowing women to own separate property and share in community property in 1840. But it was not until the passage of the Marital Property Act of 1967 that Texas gave married women the legal right to own property, secure bank loans, and start businesses, though a male cosigner was still sometimes required until later legislation. And that occurred with the passage of the Texas Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. The exclusion of black people was tied to politics, culture, religion, and economic interest. The framers made compromises to ensure the southern states would join the Union, including Article 1, Section 2, which allowed slaves to be counted as 3/5 of a person, which increased the southern states' voting power while moderating the federal government's direct tax assessment, if any. Slaves were considered property. That view was cemented in the Supreme Court 1857 decision of Dred Scott versus Sanford at 60 United States 393. Even though slavery was abolished in 1865, blacks were not granted equal protection and due process under the law until 1868, and the right to vote until 1870, and their rights were not fully granted even with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Immigrant rules have fluctuated widely. The Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed only free white persons to become U.S. citizens. By 1864, we were encouraging immigration and passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, guaranteeing citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. Ironically, in 1875, the Page Act restricted Chinese laborers, convicts, and women on the unfounded claim that women were prostitutes. We excluded Chinese again in 1882, made English a requirement in 1906, and literacy tests in 1917. The 1920s through the 50s was the era of quotas and enforcement. And from the 1960s to the present is known as the era of reforms and new challenges. That's the understatement of the year. The Braceros programs between 1942 and 1964 brought millions of Mexican workers to the United States farms which created long-term migration networks between Mexico and the United States that have shaped modern U.S.-Mexico labor relations and migration patterns of today. The programs changed frequently, were notorious for worker exploitation, where workers faced segregation, mistreatment, poor living conditions, and underpayment. The Chinese were encouraged to come to America to work. They came in droves and demonstrated extraordinary work ethic, physical characteristics, and grit. The railroad barons' demands were beyond human endurance. The pay was minimal, and the work was extremely hazardous. The Chinese workers demanded more pay, better hours, and better safety conditions. But they were met with hostility and greed. Thousands of Chinese were deported and excluded from our country, then re-invited back to do the work they did so well, and then rejected and expelled again. The government passed laws to accomplish the objectives of the railroad barons. Today, the status of immigrants is still in a state of flux, even though their contributions to the building of this nation has been extraordinary. It is worth noting that our current president, Donald Trump, is promoting a Trump Christian Bible for placement in public schools that contains a copy of the United States Constitution and the first original 10 amendments, but excludes Amendments 11 through 27, which includes the abolition of slavery, 13th Amendment, creation of birthright citizenship and due process, the 14th Amendment, grant slaves the right to vote, the 15th Amendment, and grant women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. In summary, our Constitution, as written and signed in 1787, was broken from the beginning if you were black, female, or an immigrant. It was broken because it was designed for and by propertied white men as the only citizens fit for full participation in the civic arena. Black people, women, and immigrants did not qualify. So when we say that our history has minimized that fact to make our nation look wholesome and pure and inclusive, the word white in the term whitewashed should be taken literally. And while this type of information may be distasteful, it is a necessary part of fixing America with J. Mel. Thank you for listening to this episode. See you again soon. Remember to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. Be safe and resist.